Right now, there is an invisible war being fought on a digital battlefield. It's a war for information, for intelligence, for transformation, for certainty. This invisible war has extremely visible consequences. It impacts our friends, our families, and our way of life. That's why at Peraton, we do the can't be done. Because the alternative is unimaginable.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Andrew Hallman, Vice President for National Security Strategy and Integration, Peraton.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here today and for being at this summit over the last 2 days. As is evident from what you've heard since yesterday morning and in prior summits, this forum is really an indispensable service for the intelligence community to come together with its private, public, and academic partners to discuss how to strengthen the nation's hand against a broad array of threats. As a premier mission capability integrator, Peraton is committed to programs like this to bring us together to discuss our common challenges, to discover mission solutions working together, to enable our government partners in a whole-of-nation approach to address the threats against us. Given the magnitude of the threats facing our nation and our allies, it's only through our whole-of-nation and whole-of-nations collaboration where we can address the complexity of the threat landscape and deliver those leading-edge solutions for our mission partners. In that spirit, it's a tremendous privilege to work with all of you in securing our nation, and it's my honor to introduce our last speaker for today. Jon Finer is the President's Principal Deputy National Security Advisor and brings a wealth of experience to this summit. He served with distinction for several years at the highest levels of policymaking at the White House, the Department of State, and as a well-studied practitioner of national security in academia, government, as well as a journalist covering a range of iconic conflicts and other issues of critical importance to international security. And we are indeed fortunate to have him with us today to close out our summit. He'll be joined in a moment by the Honorable Leslie Ireland, former Assistant Secretary of Treasury, veteran intelligence officer, corporate and advisory board member, and I can say close colleague and close friend for many years. Please welcome Jon Finer.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for that kind introduction. I also want to thank the leadership of INSA and AFCIA, and in particular Tish Long, Suzanne Wilson-Heckenberg, and Lieutenant General Susan Lawrence. This year's summit has brought together a remarkable array of experts, including many of my close colleagues in the interagency who I know you heard from yesterday, to discuss some of our most pressing challenges, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak with you. I am looking forward to discussing a topic that we consider to be an important innovation of this administration, which is how we have approached the interplay of intelligence, diplomacy, and public messaging to address emerging crises. Nearly 2 years ago, we faced a difficult dilemma. As summer turned to fall in 2021, we began to see mounting evidence that Russia planned to invade Ukraine with the full force of its military. 3 decades after the end of the Cold War, the prospect of a full-scale land invasion on the European continent was hard for many of us to imagine, and yet the intelligence picture, while difficult to believe at first, became increasingly impossible to deny. The first trickle of information began in August, and the picture came into focus as we moved into October, when our morning intelligence reading at the White House included assessments such as, and I'll quote, "Moscow preparing to take Ukraine if Putin greenlights plan," and "Putin probably prepared to risk war over Ukraine." The standard approach to such revelations would have been relatively restrained, quiet intelligence sharing with a handful of allies, careful diplomacy with a larger but still narrow circle of partners, but without disclosing our most sensitive information, and at some point, when the possibility of war was more obvious, a public warning to Russia that did not reveal the extent of what we knew. But we also knew that this was not a standard moment, given the enormous stakes of a major land war in Europe involving a nuclear power and the profound threat to global stability that that would entail. So instead, at the direction of President Biden, we settled on a strategy that had no real precedent and carried more risk. In close cooperation with the intelligence community, we doubled down on transparency and downgraded intelligence for a few reasons: to warn Ukraine, to inform and rally our partners, and to expose Russia's plans so as to deny it the ability to later fabricate some justification for what was premeditated aggression. The deliberate and authorized public release of intelligence, what we now refer to as strategic downgrades, has become an important tool of the Biden administration's foreign policy. This is a tool we have found to be highly effective, but also one that we believe must be wielded carefully within strict parameters and oversight. I will describe the policy framework that has guided our use of this intelligence in this novel way, including the objectives that inform whether and when we seek to downgrade intelligence for policy purposes, the process and guardrails we have established to protect sources and methods, and finally, how we envision using these strategic downgrades moving forward. Let's go back for a moment to when the intelligence community first put us on notice that Russia might invade Ukraine. When we first saw indications of a major buildup of Russian forces on the border, Russia claimed it was just conducting normal military exercises. And many consumers of this intelligence inside the administration initially doubted that war could possibly be President Putin's ultimate intention. In briefings with the president and small meetings in the Situation Room, we wrestled with questions about an approach that seemed to defy logic. Did Russia really believe it could invade, even occupy, all of Ukraine? Could it merely be bluffing and pull back its forces at the last minute, having extracted concessions? And perhaps more important, what did we need to do to prepare if the intelligence turned out to be accurate? As we gained more insight and interrogated the details, our conclusion became inescapable. Russia was indeed preparing for a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And we were previewing events that could literally change the world. For policymakers, it was a daunting proposition, but it was also a rare moment in foreign policy making where, rather than a 2 a.m. call about events that were already underway, we had some time to prepare for the worst, and we didn't want to waste a minute. So we developed and executed a strategy that saw us confront senior Russian officials privately and directly with what we knew, share more sensitive intelligence with a broader range of allies and partners than we ever had before on virtually any topic, and eventually do what we could to expose the Kremlin's plans publicly. The goal of this new playbook was simple: leverage our intelligence insights to ensure our allies and partners shared a common understanding of Russia's plans so that we could together prepare an immediate policy response that consisted of economic costs on Russia, a surge of support for Ukraine, and reassurance to frontline allies that we wouldn't let the conflict spread. It also enabled us to frustrate Russia's ability to create false pretexts that could justify an invasion. This approach was grounded from the start in President Biden's policy imperative that began at the outset of this administration, that foreign policy for the United States should begin with our alliances and partnerships, which are among America's greatest strategic assets. And every aspect of this approach was enabled by our use of intelligence. Armed with downgraded information about Russia's troop buildup, CIA Director Bill Burns traveled to Moscow in early November 2021 to make clear to President Putin and his closest advisors that we knew what they were planning and to warn them that our response would be severe. 2 weeks later, in mid-November, the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, traveled to Brussels to brief EU and NATO allies on the intelligence. and we immediately began quiet conversations with the Ukrainians to urge them to prepare for the worst. Like we had been, many of our friends were initially skeptical, and understandably so. So we returned again and again with more information until we had addressed all possible doubts. Then, in early December, we went public for the first time. Rather than simply issue a statement, we released a declassified graphic bolstered by snapshots from commercial satellite imagery that plotted on a map where Russia was in the process of amassing up to 175,000 troops along Ukraine's border. We prepared further strategic downgrades in mid-January and early February to warn in more detail of Russia's plans to fabricate pretexts, including possibly by staging military operations they would blame on Ukrainian forces or massacres purportedly carried out by Kyiv. These releases were designed and timed to bolster the intense diplomacy we were conducting with our allies and our partners, but also with Russia, which we gave every opportunity to address their alleged security concerns through direct negotiations. Finally, with war looming, we decided to issue a clearer and more imminent public warning. On February 11th, at the White House podium, Jake Sullivan briefed the press that we are, quote, in the window when an invasion could begin at any time, should Vladimir Putin decide to order it. Even more than with our private messaging, this public messaging carries further risks, including to U.S. credibility. I began my career as a journalist covering the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and the public messaging on the road to that war remained front of mind for many of us 20 years later. But the context and the case that we made this time were totally different. In that same February 11th press briefing, Jake addressed this potential parallel head-on. In Iraq, he said, intelligence was used and deployed from this very podium to start a war. We are trying to stop a war, to prevent a war, to avert a war. And all we can do is come here before you in good faith and share everything that we know to the best of our ability while protecting sources and methods so we continue to get access to the intelligence we need. Less than a week later, Secretary of State Tony Blinken traveled to New York. With Russia's representative in the United Nations Security Council looking on, the Secretary recounted all of the information that we had released going back to December, methodically exposing Russia's plans despite its repeated denials, including that day. Exactly 1 week later, on February 24th, Russia launched its massive and brutal invasion of Ukraine. In the early days of the conflict, our use of these strategic downgrades achieved two crucial objectives. First, we denied President Putin the element of surprise, which helped the Ukrainians defend themselves, and also prevented Putin from later claiming that a manufactured pretext or phony threat required him to go to war. Second, being on the same page with our partners and allies enabled us, together, to respond immediately, on day one, with robust military assistance to Ukraine and harsh sanctions and export controls against Russia, rather than taking weeks or months to put those packages together. Strategic downgrades were now a crucial part of our foreign policy toolkit. We have since established a clear process for reviewing and approving downgrades, centralized through the National Security Council staff and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And to make sure that we are taking acceptable risks for the most desirable foreign policy benefits, we have prioritized key topics for this work, including attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure so that we can warn the Ukrainians and undermine Russian denials, including Russian false flag operations and other disinformation so the world would know the truth, and including third country military support for Russia to make it as uncomfortable as possible for the Kremlin's potential partners. It's worth spending a moment on two of these three priority categories. First, on Russia's efforts to import foreign weapons. As the war began to turn badly for Russia and their stocks of munitions dwindled, Moscow sought military equipment and support from other countries. But their effort faced a significant vulnerability. Countries willing to provide support to Russia tended to want to do so in secret. By exposing their plans publicly, alongside allies and partners, we put foreign governments on the defensive and in many cases deterred and dissuaded them from providing further support to Moscow. Early on, we had information that Russia sought military hardware from China, including drones. We communicated our concerns to Beijing and released information publicly. As a result, despite their self-proclaimed no-limits partnership, we have yet to see the PRC provide substantial lethal aid to Russia's war effort, though we watch this closely every day. We also saw signs that Russia was deepening its cooperation with Iran, including purchasing drones from Tehran. We moved quickly to expose this, including by releasing satellite imagery. And we warned that Iran was also considering the sale of ballistic missiles to Russia, which we have seen no indication has actually occurred. Then, as Russia looked further afield for weapons and equipment to replace its diminishing stockpiles, we also exposed attempts by the Wagner Group, the now infamous Wagner Group, to secure arms and ammunition from North Korea. Here, too, in the aftermath of our disclosures, we saw an increased reluctance by even Pyongyang to provide support to Moscow. We have also prioritized using downgrades to highlight the harm to civilians. This means releasing information on Russian attacks on grain storage facilities, which have caused grave damage in Ukraine and to food supply chains around the world, on Russia's so-called filtration camps, on the appalling forced deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia, on summary executions of civilians and attacks on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, and on Russia's attempts to conduct sham referenda to justify annexing occupied areas of Ukraine. Key allies, particularly the UK, complemented the information we released by downgrading their own information. Now, we have done all of this fully cognizant that if done irresponsibly, downgrading intelligence is fraught with risk to our collection and to our credibility if we get it wrong. It is a constant balancing effort to determine what and how much to reveal while protecting sources and methods and maintaining the highest possible standards of rigor and accuracy. 18 months into this conflict, we have drawn a number of lessons from this effort. First, our credibility is a vital asset. In an information environment plagued by half-truths, exaggeration, and outright lies, what the United States government shares diplomatically and in public must be accurate and based on verifiable reporting. Second, downgrades are most effective when they are part of an integrated approach with our diplomacy, our security assistance, and our economic tools. Third, we recognize that the U.S. is sometimes not the best positioned messenger to deliver this information. Our partners and the media provide important independent voices and views. Fourth, a rigorous and centralized process, coordinated by the National Security Council staff and in close coordination with the intelligence community, has enabled us to act with rigor, agility, and attention to detail. We have been able to make decisions on whether and when to release information based on a 360-degree visibility across the government. It also seeks to prevent creating a permissive environment of uncoordinated or unauthorized releases, and ensures that we maintain a clear record of what has been authorized and what has been approved. Fifth, this effort has required a close partnership with the intelligence community, which provided vital warning and really leaned into this effort, adapted quickly, and worked with us to balance the diplomatic imperative to reveal what we know with the need to protect what they have found. In partnership, we have leveraged all source information, including open source information, including commercially available imagery, to generate authorized downgraded language that could be disclosed to the public. Finally, our ability to warn is only as good as our collection and our insights. If you allow me to digress for a moment on a related topic, this includes, crucially, intelligence that we collect through Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA. That law will expire at the end of this year, at the end of this fiscal year, unless it is renewed by Congress. The information it provides is vital to our national security. We have used it to identify and protect against the full range of threats faced by the U.S. and our allies, including abuses perpetrated by Russia throughout this war. Section 702 has helped us uncover gruesome atrocities committed by Russia in Ukraine, including the murder of non-combatants, the forced relocation of children, and the detention of refugees fleeing violence. And we remain in dialogue with Congress on a series of unprecedented improvements and reforms that would enhance privacy and oversight while fully preserving this important tool and its vital role in our security. Looking ahead, strategic downgrades of intelligence are a tool we're prepared to use even beyond the Russia-Ukraine conflict, so long as we do so carefully and within strict guidelines. We think this tool can be most effective to build and strengthen alliances and partnerships by ensuring a common operating picture, to expose preparations for war and acts of aggression, including efforts to fabricate pretexts and supply lethal weapons to support conflict, and to disrupt efforts by strategic competitors to undermine U.S. partnerships and expand their military and intelligence reach. Careful, considered, and targeted use of strategically downgraded and declassified intelligence is likely here to stay, but it will also require one indispensable input in order for us to succeed: the exquisite quality of the information that we collect. We are blessed in the United States to be the very best in the world at that. That's why it's such an honor to be here alongside so many professionals who have been involved in that work. I'm grateful for everything they do. I appreciate all of your time today, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
And it's now my pleasure to welcome Leslie Ireland, today's moderator, to the stage. Leslie, over to you.
Thank you very much. How are you? Oh, John, thank you. Thank you for those remarks. And before I go further, let me just say thank you for your service. If you've been in government, you know that there's a lot of sacrifice that's involved. And in a position like yours in particular, you are being part of decisions every day that are life and death. And I'm sure that's not without its sacrifices, so thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
You're welcome. So, and thank you for those comments. I think I had, sitting on the outside now, and having been used to being on the inside, you see what you see in the newspapers, but this really gave a very complete picture of the whole process and the thoughtfulness that went into that, and I appreciated hearing that. You've obviously mentioned that the strategic downgrades are now going to be a tool of U.S. foreign policy with the broader economic, military sanctions, et cetera, and that they need to be employed carefully within strict guardrails and in specific contexts. Can you elaborate on that a bit, please?
Sure. I think it goes without saying that one of the things we have been most concerned about is not being seen as essentially giving license or giving permission for people to pursue this sort of approach on their own or ad hoc. That would obviously be quite dangerous if it were not done rigorously, and we obviously live in an environment where people like me are constantly frustrated by the unauthorized disclosure of intelligence information, which is something we obviously just can't tolerate. So it's been important to us to put in place a process that both can move quickly enough to be relevant policy-wise, because sometimes this information is only useful if you can get it downgraded in a rapid fashion, but also does so rigorously enough that our intelligence partners are comfortable that what must be protected has been protected. And so it's a process that we have refined over time, and we think it is important and effective when it's done the right way and also done for the right reasons. It should always be in service of clear policy objectives. It's not like you just get a piece of very interesting information that could sort of, damage one of your adversaries and decide, oh, that could be embarrassing to them, let's put it out. It should be consistent with and in service of and integrated with a broader strategic approach as it was in the context of Russia and Ukraine.
Right. I think that's a really important point that in my experience, rarely is one tool in the toolbox the one that's going to be successful. It has to be a combination and a very coordinated effort. I'm also hopeful that in releasing this information, you will preempt anybody who thinks that that needs to be taken care of that way. So you did that in Russia, Ukraine. Do you envision any other scenarios outside that context where this could be useful?
Sure, absolutely. I think I gave in my remarks some of the theories and the areas where we think this kind of information can be most useful. I have to say, I think one place is where forewarning is valuable, either to a country or an interest that could be damaged, where you can give kind of time to prepare, as we were able to do for the Ukrainians in that context. That is one important area, as opposed to, for example, revealing something that has already happened in the past. There may be instances where that's useful too, but I think the former is where we have found kind of the most utility in this approach. But again, the imperative there is that you got to be right, because if you go out with alarming the world that something terrible is going to happen and it doesn't, or you have it wrong, it will be much harder to use the tool effectively the next time. So yes, we fully intend to use this sort of capability outside of the Russia-Ukraine context. We have done it to an extent already. In the case of the infamous Chinese spy balloon, we were able to quite quickly get out into the public with what we thought that was and wasn't, what risk there was or wasn't to our interests and to the American people. In the case, I'll give you another example of the Wagner Group's involvement on the African continent, in particular in Mali. We have been able to point to destabilizing activities that were not publicly known, that were underway, that helped us try to avoid bad outcomes that could have happened otherwise. And so those are just two examples of what I expect over time will be many.
Yeah. As a former intelligence professional, I would also think that sharing that information with other governments can help get more intelligence. They will then turn to their sources, they will then turn to their networks, and they'll see what they can do to flesh out what the United States is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the big incentives, I think one of the achievements really of this administration, and you saw it over the course of the last week, that we feel most proud of is how much we have deepened and strengthened our alliances and partnerships. And part of the value proposition that the United States has is this world-class, kind of best-in-class intelligence service. And when that can benefit other countries and their security as well, it just increases the kind of self-evident value of having close relations with the United States.
Right, and that U.S. intelligence is really a reflection of access. It's not a reflection of everything that's out there. So if you can increase that pool of different access, I think you've gone a great way.
And you're also right that it goes both ways. There are things other countries know that we don't, and so this enables an exchange.
Yeah. One last comment I'll just add to you on this is that you weren't just helping other countries, you were helping corporate America. Any company that had a presence in Russia who could be or Ukraine, who could be reading this in the newspapers, had a better opportunity to prepare for what kind of policy initiatives might be coming, what kinds of actions they might need to take to protect their employees. I'm on the board of directors of Citigroup, and I can just thank you for that, because I think it made a big difference for the way we were able to handle it.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. And obviously part of this, especially once you start to go public, is not just in service of kind of helping governments prepare, but helping regular people who might otherwise not be privy to any of this information be able to make their own decisions about what to do if such circumstances are coming their way.
Right.
Yeah.
So I mentioned about access and how critical access is for us. You mentioned about the FISA Section 702 coming to a close or sunsetting here at the end of the year. What is the administration's approach to getting this authority renewed?
Yeah, so I guess I'd say two things, two parts to our approach. One is we were making the strongest possible case, and we think the case is actually incredibly strong for how valuable FISA is. We're making a slightly different case than has been made in previous rounds of reauthorization of Section 702, in part because we think the most valuable uses of this tool have evolved over time. This used to be primarily, demonstrated as a counterterrorism tool. Mm-hmm. Now we think it is actually central to our work to compete with and counter some of what the PRC is doing. Certainly, I described its value in the context of Russia and Ukraine. It has real value in identifying foreign sources of precursors of fentanyl and other narcotics of concern, and it has huge value in enhancing our cybersecurity. And so it's those kind of new and emerging areas where we are explaining with very clear, very detailed vignettes of previous uses how valuable this tool is, which, by the way, information derived from Section 702 is responsible for more than 60% of articles that appear in the President's Daily Brief every morning. So this is really essential. But the other case that we're making, which is equally important, is that we are prepared to be responsive to what many members of Congress have called for and many people in our own administration strongly support, which is enhancements to oversight and privacy protections under Section 702. We're in close dialogue with Congress about a number of steps that we have already taken that we would be willing to codify, and about a number of additional steps that we would look at building into reauthorization as it comes up for consideration by Congress later this year.
Again, I think that's critical, what you're doing. I think having that kind of access is going to be crucial to continued success that the intelligence community has. Confess I haven't followed all the newspaper coverage on it, but how transparent are you being in kind with these downgrades? How transparent are you being with the American public about the importance of 702?
We are increasingly making the case both publicly and directly to key members on the Hill, but this is something I think you're going to see us talking more about. We have already done a series of interviews, of op-eds, of podcasts and other things, and I think it's important because there is a lot of information out there about this tool, some of which is accurate, some of which we think is misleading, and what we really want to make clear to people is, one, this has real value for protecting the country and our security, and two, we are ready, willing, and already working on ways in which to enhance oversight and protections of privacy, which have been the two big concerns that people have expressed.
Absolutely. So I want to step away a little bit from your remarks and ask you some questions about another topic that's been a big one here in the conference today, and that is artificial intelligence. You can't go a day without hearing either Arnold Schwarzenegger and the Terminator were right, or it's the next thing that's really going to save us, and someplace in the middle. So how is the administration thinking about AI? What is the strategy for dealing with this technology that is rapidly evolving?
Thank you. So look, this is obviously a huge kind of whole of government effort underway to get our arms around the implications of this technology, which probably more than anything else in our lifetimes, if not much longer than that, will have just fundamental implications for almost everything that we do in the government and in everyday life. The president has been very clear that he sees both incredible promise in this technology and also real risks. And so part of our approach is going to be making sure that, on behalf of the United States, we are positioning the country to be able to take advantage to the greatest extent possible of that promise while mitigating the risks. On the national security side, we're concerned about a range of potential applications of AI in the realm of cybersecurity when it comes to bio uses of AI, when it comes to disinformation and misinformation. And so we are both doing our own thinking and also working very importantly with the private sector, which is sort of the leading edge of the development of this technology, on what, if any, guardrails are going to be necessary to try to place around some of these risks that we're most concerned about. And then we will also be working in very close collaboration and partnership with our partners and allies who are like-minded to try to develop and engender common approaches, which is always critically important when there are these emerging technologies around which there are not yet norms that have been established.
So administration came out with a national cyber strategy. Do you envision a similar strategy on artificial intelligence?
Don't want to get ahead of anything that may or may not be coming, but what I can say is I expect you will see this administration speak to these issues with increasing frequency and increasing detail in the weeks to come.
Okay, very good. And then also, in some of the conversations that I have heard about AI, there is a fairly constant theme about a need for regulation. Has the administration given any thought to that?
I can tell you we've given thought to just about every dimension of this that you would have been reading about in the public debate. I won't, again, get ahead of any announcements on that, but as I said, I think any approach that we take policy-wise or that Congress takes or that anybody takes, including our foreign counterparts, we expect to be predicated on two things. One, trying to seize as much as possible the opportunities that this creates, and two, to try to mitigate the very real risks that we're concerned about.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I appreciate your candor.
Of course.
And I appreciate the time that you've taken. I'm sure you've got things burning back in the West Wing, so thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Nice to meet you.
And I'm going to ask John and Leslie if they can hold tight for just a second, because we'll have a photographer come up here, and we just have a couple of brief closing remarks. But really appreciate your candid insights, John and Leslie. Thank you for moderating the conversation today. What a terrific way to include the summit after 2 really enriching days. Please join me in another round of applause for our closing speaker and moderator, as well as the other IC leaders who have joined us over the past couple of days.
As we bring this summit to a close, I want to thank all our speakers, sponsors, the exhibitors. Did everybody get a chance to visit the exhibit hall? Phenomenal. Record number of attendees this year, record number of exhibitors. And the AFC and INSA staffs for executing a flawless event, with special thanks on that front to John Doyon and Ray Cross, Bishop Garrison, Sidney Williams, Lauren Hugh, Gretchen Gunning, Toya Cribbs, Allie Bailey, and Tina Vicioso. These are people who've been seated working hard up front or working in the back rooms. We're all instrumental to the event's success. And of course, thank you to Susan Lawrence and to Tish Long, of the leaders of AFCEA and INSA, the 2 great partners who create opportunities for other public-private partnerships across the national security landscape.
Thank you, Louis. And I'd also like to give a shout out to the Gaylord. I'm hopeful they'll have us back around this time next year. Stay tuned for the announcement for the 2024 summit. But most of all, I really want to thank you all for sharing the past 2 days with us. Again, to our exhibitors and sponsors and to all of our speakers. Please travel safely to wherever you're going at the end of the day today. And thanks again, and another round of applause.